Let's talk about Sony Stabilization, IBIS or Active Steady. What about Catalyst Browse and Gyro Data? IBIS on a gimbal or not? What about tripods? In this video, I'm going to answer all these questions, as well as bust a few myths that's been floating around here on YouTube. Now, this video is not sponsored in any way. I just received so many questions and comments about the topic that I finally decided to share my understanding. I believe my handout footage speaks for itself, and that's because I figured out which mode to use in which scenario, plus the physical technique that comes with it. First on the list, we've got stabilization using gyro data, something I'd like to call the Catalyst myth. Since its release, Catalyst Browse has been portrayed as the magical fix for not needing a gimbal, and on the surface, it does look promising. Although some of the footage comes out pretty clean, they all seem to leave out one very important detail. A detail that to me is a deal breaker. You see, there's a free version of Catalyst Browse and a paid version called Catalyst Prepare, and the biggest difference between the two is the fact that Catalyst Browse can only export in 8-bit and not 10-bit. I can understand why some creators don't mention this, because if you look at the file info, it does display 10-bit, but in reality, it's just a wrapper. The actual clip is still very much 8-bit. A quick test to confirm this is to export a clip from Catalyst Browse. You don't even have to stabilize it. Just selecting same as source, which one would assume is going to be 10-bit 422, right? Wrong. You can put the same color grade over both clips, and the one from Catalyst will quickly fall apart, with severe banding and artifacts. That's because of the conversion from log. The 8-bit file is just not able to handle it. If you don't see it straight away, just push the grade a little more and it's pretty obvious. This is a massive issue if you're shooting in S-Log and want to do any form of color grading. On the flip side, when you use the paid version of Catalyst Prepare, you're getting clean 10-bit 422 footage, as one would expect. But my issue here is that in order to get amazing results, you have to crank up the shutter. Stabilizing footage at the normal 180-degree shutter can introduce serious blur in the image, and the only way around this is an increased shutter speed. Personally, this is also a deal breaker for me because I love the natural motion blur that comes with 24-25 frames per second at a 180-degree shutter angle. The very thing that makes the footage feel more realistic and cinematic. In some action scenarios, one might double the shutter for effect, but even then, if you want to get gimbal-like results, you might have to push the shutter even higher, which to me defeats the purpose. Using gyro data can also crop in severely if you want to achieve silky smooth results. So I always prefer to shoot more stable in camera before going to post. The only time I will opt for Catalyst Prepare is if I'm shooting on the FX6 and I can't manage the stabilization in post. The funny thing is the FX6 footage, even without IBIS, still has a way of coming out smoother because of the extra weight, even more prominent when you rig it up. So with Catalyst out of the way, what about IBIS and Active Steady? And what about the new dynamic stabilization that was introduced with the ZV-E1? Just to get dynamic stab out of the way quickly, it's something I simply won't use and I don't recommend it for professional use. Dynamic stab is the equivalent of using Catalyst in camera, but without the ability to tweak the footage afterwards. You're getting 10-bit for sure, but it's a gamble how the footage will look depending on the scenario. It crops in far too much for my liking and I just don't believe it's necessary, which brings me to Active Steady and IBIS. Active Steady works incredibly well, and I often use it, but only in the following scenarios. When you're shooting handout and you want to push the camera forward or move it backwards. Even when walking, Active Steady does a great job here, but in general, you'll get better results from 35mm and up. And with your wide lenses, you're bound to get some warp in the corners. The major issue with Active Steady is when you use it on a gimbal. Active Steady battles against a gimbal and you'll probably see some sort of warping in the edges if you do big movements. It's also a no-go when panning left or right, like trying to track a subject coming past. I first really noticed this when shooting skiing in the Swiss Alps. If you pan just a little too fast, the image jumps a bit and ruins the shot. Active Steady also shines when you put on longer lenses. Anything over 70mm and it's like magic, especially when tracking a subject sideways. The following shots are all on 200mm tracking sideways, not to be confused with panning. This specific shot was handout from a cable car and the rest is all from a gimbal. But wait, didn't you just say not to use Active Steady when on a gimbal? This is the only exception. Longer focal lengths like 70mm and up work well here, but only if you track a subject and refrain from doing rapid pans left or right. Before moving on to IBIS, I feel it's important to explain this concept. Just as a high shutter speed helps with stabilization in post, on the flip side, a lower shutter speed helps make your in-camera footage look more stable, because the subtle motion blur helps to disguise some of the shake. Yep, it's basically like opposites. Shooting at a high shutter speed without any form of stabilization in post will amplify the feeling of shakiness, because the movements are naturally sharper. When shooting at a 180-degree shutter, your in-camera footage looks smoother, but the freedom to stabilize in post is smaller. I prefer to shoot in-camera as stable as possible, so that a subtle post-stabilization will be enough without taking the risk of serious crop and sacrificing motion blur. Steady shot, aka IBIS. Still my go-to for almost everything. There's this myth that you should disable IBIS when you're on a gimbal or on a tripod, and it's simply not true. No matter how many tests I've done, IBIS wins every single time. Some will argue that you should disable it when you're on a tripod, but it really doesn't affect your stable static shots in any way, but still helps with any micro vibrations that comes with handling the camera. Like in this case, changing the aperture on 200mm, you can clearly see which one has IBIS enabled. When using manual or cinema lenses, it's super important to dial in the custom focal length of each lens before shooting, because if the wrong focal length is selected, it can actually cause more shake. IBIS is the secret sauce to eliminating micro vibrations on anything, and I never shoot without it, unless I go up to active steady. The rest is only up to how you physically handle the camera. There's a ton of ways to stabilize the camera. The ninja walk, locking your arms and moving with your body. But my favorite is still to make the camera heavier. Although I really use the extra accessories on some of my rigs, I sometimes feel like I just want to rig it up for the sake of making the camera heavier. It's one thing to make the camera heavy, but more important is to make it balanced, which means it shouldn't lean more towards any side when holding it by the top handle. Getting stable footage is something that I've gotten better at over the years, and the more you practice, the more you'll improve. Although shooting in slow motion also helps with stability, this should never be the reason why you shoot in slow-mo. Let me say that again. If you're only shooting in slow motion for stability's sake, you're missing the point. Frame rates can have such a massive impact on the pace and feeling of your film, and changing this just for the sake of stability defeats the purpose. Last but not least, stabilizing in post. Yes, I still stabilize my footage in post, even my gimbal shots. Sometimes it's just to take out a subtle shake, and sometimes it's to dramatically smooth out a shaky shot. I'm not going to do a tutorial about this since I'm in Resolve and some of you are on Final Cut and Premiere Pro, but the concept will always be the same. Make sure you choose the right mode of stabilization, and if it's too intense, dial it down a bit to get the balance between shake that's acceptable and footage that doesn't blur because of a lower shutter speed. This method works for about 99% of the shots I ever shoot, and if there's one that I can't use, I'm either gonna cut it or just use it anyway. But the fact is, I know how far I can push my handheld footage in the field, and that comes with experience. So my best advice is to keep on practicing, and before you know it, this is a topic that you just won't think about anymore. As always, comments, drop them down below and I'll do my best to answer. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.